I'm sure there are no questions. It was pretty non-controversial. Who wants to confirm this? What is the first response?
Having heard a lecture about the Mycenaean palaces from an economic perspective, which downplayed their economic importance, what is, in your view, the power basis of Mycenaean palace?
Oh, yeah, so I wouldn't downplay their economic force. I mean, I guess what I would say is that it's both greater and less than we think that it is. It's less insofar as they're not these controlling institutions, right? They're not telling farmers what to grow, right? Which is the old sort of redistributive model. They're not telling traders, they're not controlling trade routes. At least I don't see them controlling trade routes in that way. On the other hand, their power, I would argue, is much more capillary, right? So that, I mean, obviously they do have they have a certain authority. They have authority to tax. They tax agricultural goods, which they can repurpose for things like feasts, to control laborers who are in charge of making textiles, right? They do a lot. So it's not as if they're nothing. They're not nothing. But I would say their power is more capillary in the sense that the palaces restructure the economy so that they change the economic calculus of which every decision maker in their community, right? So their effects are widely felt, both sort of in the real world, but also in the archaeological record, right? But then what I would argue is that we tend to interpret those patterns as control, when in fact they're the result of economic activity that's basically going on in the same way that it's going on later. It's just restructured, right? So, for example, something that I left out is that imports are really concentrated especially at Mycenae, also Tiryns, also Thebes. And you could look at that and say, oh, well, see, the palaces controlled imports because the imports all end up, or mostly end up at palatial centers. But there's another way to spin that, right? If we found that, like, there's lots of Audis in Athens, and not many Audis in Sparta. I mean, in modern Greece, I'm talking about now, obviously. We wouldn't conclude that, like, Athens controlled the import market to Audis, right? Because we live in a capitalistic market system. So, when you say imports, when someone says imports cluster at Mycenae, and that shows Mycenae controls imports, you're making an assumption about the way that the economy works, which could be correct, right? I'm not saying that that's wrong. I'm just saying that it's a circular kind of argumentation because it presumes the very model that you're confirming. Does that make sense? So, I mean, I think the palace is, the power source, I'm going to try to answer your question more directly. I would say the power source of the palace is the very fact that it's capable of harnessing the economic production of this broad Mycenaean elite to its own ends. Right? They're able to get elites to buy into the system, at least for a couple of hundred years. Right? So you have a large group of individuals who are involved in palatial activity. I think it has to be voluntarily, or something like voluntarily. There's really no evidence that the palace did or even could compel high-level individuals to participate in the system.
But if first I have to convince the economic players to buy into my system,
yeah,
then the basis of my power is not economic.
Right. Yeah. So it's So I guess I and other people have argued that it's largely ideological, right? So the importance of you helped me answer the question. Like feasting, for example, right? I wrote this article where I added up all of the staples recorded in the linear B texts. And it turns out slightly more than half of them seem to be earmarked for feasts. So, half, if it's at all representative, which doesn't have to be, but if it is representative, then the palace is taking, skimming off the top, taking a lot of agricultural material, and then immediately converting that into into ceremonies that confirm the centrality of the center, and so on and so forth. And that kind of basically tallies with the fact that like most Mycenaean palaces on the mainland don't seem to have enormous storage capacities, right? So like if they were a classically redistributive system, like where would they put all this grain? There isn't. Like at Pylos, where would they put it? There's nowhere for them to put it. So yeah, it's ideological, and it's focused on converting material into symbolic capital. But then why does this like stop working around 1200 BC? I don't have an answer to that. Yeah, that's totally unclear. But I think part of the answer has to be that people stop buying in for whatever reason. They see the palace as not central to I don't know, to their lives, to their goals in life, or something like that. Yeah.
Other questions, comments, opposition?
Assuming that the Homeric works reflect late Bronze Age society,
Yeah.
is there anything in the Iliad or the Odyssey to vindicate this theory?
So yeah.
It's an open question. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, so the history of scholarship is interesting here. So immediately after the decipherment, Moses Finley writes a review of documents in Mycenaean Greek, which is the sort of Bible of Mycenaean studies. I saw it somewhere on the corner of my eye here. And Finley says, what Finley says is like, look at this system. This looks nothing like the Homeric economy, right? And he severs the link which had been made by previous generations of archaeologists between Homer and the late Bronze Age, at least in economic terms. And I think Finley's basically right, that the system that we see here is not the same as the Homeric
So
system.
it's post-Homeric.
Yeah, so the argument would be is that the Homeric poems represent a long evolving tradition of oral song that has its roots in the late Bronze Age, but is constantly evolving, right? So Homeric epic can preserve certain fossils from the late Bronze Age. It manifestly does that. But the social structure reflected in the Homeric epics is going to be something that contemporary audiences can understand. And the fixing of the Homeric epic, so the fixing of this oral tradition, this oral song tradition, into texts can't happen before the middle of the 8th century BC, and most Homerists would push it much later. So that people are pushing into the 7th and the 6th centuries BC. And that's true both of oral scholars and of scholars who are working with a kind of dictation system. So that's true of like Martin West, and it's true of Gregory Nage, who are sort of like the opposite ends of the spectrum in terms of this issue. So that's what most people would say, is that the economic, the sort of economic system reflected in the Homeric epics is essentially a much later system that doesn't have anything to do with the Mycenaean palaces. It does retain other things though. So for example, names in Homer, personal names in Homer, very often end in eos, like Achilleus, Odysseus, right? That's very uncommon in the 7th century BC. It's very common in the Linear B tablets. So naming patterns apparently in Homer do reflect, not consciously, but in some way seem to reflect late Bronze Age naming patterns. So there are some continuities, but economically I don't think so. I guess the thing I would say is that these elites, the way I've described them, would be very familiar to a Homeric audience, right? So they control sheep, they're traders, they're warriors, they're raiders. What else did I talk about? Well, Homeric chieftains aren't craft specialists usually. They have control over land, right? So that sort of package of elite behavior is something that seems to be preserved from the Bronze Age through the Homeric epics. But the overall structure, the structure that they're doing that in is very different, right? Because there are these palaces.
Other questions, comments? Somebody, yes, you're going to ask.
If there's no expert who has a question. As a non-expert, I would like to ask something. In general, I think your picture is very convincing, particularly in the context of the ancient East more broadly.
Yeah.
So for the Hittites, something similar has been argued as well. And for Mesopotamia, as you showed.
Egypt's different, right?
Egypt is completely different,
Yeah.
but nevertheless, for the ancient East. I still wonder though, what happens to these traders and these entrepreneurs once the palaces crash? Is really the structure of Mycenaean palace culture, is that simply a loss in symbolic value? And can we then can we simply perhaps say that the economic enterprise just goes on and goes on and it goes on, it just continues and is differently ideologized, and this is where we get the fragmentation and decentralization. So I'm wondering almost whether the decentralization hypothesis really needs to fall with your argument as well, or whether we cannot just say that decentralization is now more visible than it was before.
That's certainly the case. It's certainly more visible. So the economic activity seems to continue. This is actually one of the arguments against the idea that the palaces control trade routes, because after the palaces fall, stuff just keeps going on. It goes on in a different way, right? So destinations are somewhat different, but people are still trading, right? That doesn't collapse. It certainly goes down, but the overall economy goes down too. So if you correct, this is something that Sarah Murray did in her dissertation. If you correct, if you look at imports over time, but you correct for demographic decline, which there almost certainly is, people are also moving around, right? If you correct for demographic decline, it basically stays flat. And Bill Parkinson's also done this by looking at contacts. So for example, like at Thebes, you might find like 3 seals that are all from the same place and are all found in the same archaeological context, right? So that doesn't require 3 trips, it requires 1 trip. So if you deal with the evidence that way, that is to say, look in terms of contacts, minimum number of contacts, 3B and 3C, the chart turns flat. So the trade networks are still operating. Cyprus does seem to become more central to them. I think that much is clear, and and it also tends to shoot west. So the Adriatic network seems to activate, at least with respect to the Aegean. So you don't have a lot of Adriatic material in the Aegean during the period of the palaces. This is an argument that Parkinson and Galati and Helena and Thomas have made. But before and after, it is. And then you get much more interest in places like Sardinia, right? And the Central Mediterranean and further afield. So the networks seem to expand somewhat, and they do become more decentralized, so that you find not more stuff, but stuff more spread out. I would see that as an issue of consumption rather than an issue of exchange, and I would see it also as an issue of deposition. So I think that obviously when we're dealing with the residues of these trade patterns, we have to think both in terms of exchange, but also consumption and deposition, right? And those things change over time. So, for example, tombs at the height of the Mycenaean palaces tend not to be wealthy, excepting those that have been looted, I suppose, right? The big tholoi. But most of them, you actually see a decrease in wealth. You see it in Pylos, you see it all over the Greek mainland, right? It's something that Kavanaugh and me have pointed out. And I don't think that has to do with the fact that people in the palatial systems don't have stuff. They have stuff. But mortuary display seems not to be something that is particularly important in the 13th century BC. It becomes more important later, right? It becomes more important in the 12th century BC. And you start to see the deposition of heirlooms and this other kind of stuff. So, there's all kinds of crazy factors, and it's very hard to control for them. But yeah, you're right, that the decentralization, that effect seems to be real. I'm more arguing about the underlying causes of it, right? That I think this entrepreneurial activity is part of the palatial system, and then it just continues. And that's also true in ancient Near East, right? The fall of big imperial powers doesn't seem to be a problem for wealthy merchants located on the Levantine coast or in Cyprus, right? They just keep plugging along. because they don't seem to depend on the palaces for their networks, right? If anything, the palace probably depends more on them for their networks, right?
Does that also provide an, sorry, I'm pretty sick, but does it also provide an answer to why the palaces weren't rebuilt? Because it's just ideological failure, and that's the end of that, and they just go on and do that.
Yeah, that's sort of my, I guess it's sort of my it's sort of my operating hypothesis at the moment. But I don't know, it's hard to account for all of the activity and the fact that a lot of mainland centers, I talked about this at the open meeting, there seems, in some places anyway, there's a real interest in the palace. So the Tyrians, for example, in 3C, they come back, they clear some rubble, they rebuild building T, but then like, what does that mean? You know, that's an open question. Yeah. So Maran, you know, for example, the excavator Tyrians, there's a big break between 3B and 3C, between the palatial destructions, and that their way of thinking about the palace is very different. I'm not so sure.
We can continue these discussions and questions in the reception and after the cutting of the pizza. Before I thank Dimitri for his lecture, I wanted to point out to you that, one, if you can't make it, our lectures are streamed. You can go to our website during the lecture and watch it. Watch the lecture. Secondly, don't forget, 2 weeks from today, Brendan Burke from the University of Victoria is going to be talking about wealth. I think it's going to span, we're not just going to stay in the late Bronze Age, but it'll still be that topic of wealth and how did it get where it ended up. So those two things. And Dimitri, you started in the 12th century for your open meeting lecture, and then now moved to the 13th and 14th century. I'm not sure you're ready for the January 1st, 1200 BC lecture on explaining what happened. But we would like to have you come back and an exciting project that Dimitri is working on with a group of other people. It's called Digital Nestor, which is the digitization, 3D documentation of all of the administrative documents from Pylos. And I would like you to come back and talk to us about what it is and what you found. Obviously, your command from your PhD and from this project indicates your knowledge of this important archive. And I'm not sure, we're going to wait at LM for a 3D archive?
Sure.
Okay. We're going to have LM produce a 3D archive as well. So let's thank Dimitri.